Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. My name is Joshua Mobley, and I am joined by our very own Dr. Untek David Shin. It's a privilege having you here. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Josh.
Okay, so Dr. Shin is a visiting assistant professor of theology at Wheaton College. Just before taking that position, he was here at Baylor University as a postdoctoral teaching fellow. We had the privilege of teaching together in the Honors College, so it's a real joy to be interviewing my friend and colleague.
Yeah, that's right. Those were some fun days. Yeah,
Yes.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being here. David has recently published this book, Rest, a Theological Account, which came out with us, Baylor University Press, just last year, and it has been very well received and is a remarkable book. It's a reworking of your doctoral dissertation, and is an incredible account of what it means to live in rest in a world that is not particularly restful.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here. Let me ask you about that, because we do live in a world that is very much not restful at the moment. And I think it does seem to be a topic that is perhaps trending in circles. So a number of books that have come out, more popular level books about how to live restfully, how to unplug, or how to thinking about books about hurrying and not hurrying and these kinds of things. So it does seem to be a topic that's kind of in the water, so to speak. But you are actually providing here not like a sort of technical how-to or a self-help book, but actually a kind of theological account of what it means to rest. So could you help us understand, when you say a theological account, what do you mean? Like, what differentiates this book from other books that are talking about, how to live a more peaceful life?
Yeah. I love that question. The first thing I'll say is that there are books that are quite theological and does talk about rest. Kelly Kapich's book is one of them. He's fairly theological, but also geared toward the everyday Christian audience.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that I try to do to make it more theologically robust, I try to understand human existence in relation to the triune God and how the triune God works, right?
Yeah.
So Irenaeus says the Father creates through his two hands, the Son and the Spirit. And so what would it mean, I ask, for God to recreate us through the Son and Spirit and delimit the domains of our lives? And how do we respond to that as humans? And the idea is that as long as we are living in sync with the way in which God works, our lives are limited and thereby a little bit more restful.
Okay.
And so I guess the answer is I try to think more about who God is and how God works in relation to that and how we respond to it.
Yeah. So kind of what, John Webster would have called like theological theology, right? So something centered on the life of God a little more directly.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know if I am as robust as John Webster, but at least trying to go in that direction.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you talk about in your opening chapter, you kind of delineate various uses of the term rest. And I thought that it was quite helpful because it seems like an obvious thing to talk about. But the minute you start poking at that word, it sort of unravels pretty quickly. You differentiate between restfulness, rest, and restlessness.
Yeah.
So can you walk us through those three different categories?
Yeah, happy to do so. So the impetus behind that distinction was that people seem to use the word rest in a lot of different ways, right? Sometimes we hear in a sermon a preacher saying, well, you got to rest in God, right? At other times, people are saying, well, have a restful weekend. And so you're doing stuff like going on a vacation or hiking a mountain, or a lot of things you can do.
Yeah.
And so I make the distinction between restfulness, and restlessness, where I define rest as our ontological state, a state of dependence. And so when I'm resting, just as a cup rests in a saucer, I'm also resting in something. And as I understand it, for the Christian imagination, it means to rest in God. And we do so consciously and actively. It's almost as if we are following the command to pray ceaselessly, and we are doing that as we rest in God. And resting in God also means to rest not only God in God's self, but also the way in which God is working, therefore God's economy. And so rest is a way of denotating the way in which we relate to things around us, and particularly God.
Yeah.
And restfulness is, as I define it, is the fruit of resting in God. And so it can manifest psychologically or physiologically. And I also say, we can talk about this later on, but you don't necessarily have to rest in God to experience restfulness. I think non-Christians can also experience restfulness, but that's what I mean by restfulness, right? And restlessness, really, there's really two kinds of restlessness, right? When I'm not depending on God, I'm not resting, and therefore I'm restless. There's also the physiological or psychological kind of restlessness, which is a counterpart of restfulness. So if I'm anxious at night, I think about the dumb things I say, for example, in a podcast. I'm like, oh shoot, my mind is restless. That's the kind of restlessness, second kind of restlessness I have in mind.
Well, you said a couple things there that I'd like to follow up on. So you talk about being at rest as a kind of a way of praying without ceasing, which maybe you said a sort of a way of praying without ceasing, which is a really intriguing thought, because I think that injunction, that command to pray without ceasing does not feel like a restful one.
No.
Especially if you don't particularly like sitting around praying. And so, but you seem to be suggesting that actually there's a different mode that could take on. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that I don't quite unpack in the book itself, but I'm happy to think through it. So when we pray without ceasing, it's not literally the case that we are on our knees and praying to God, right? So as you say, it's a kind of mindfulness, a state of being. Here I'm reminded of an author that we've both taught, Aristotle, who says that we build character through the repetition of similar actions, right? I wonder if in moments of worship and prayer in Christian living, we cultivate a kind of way of living, a kind of habit that results in an imprinting of the kind of person that we desire to be. In that way, even though I'm not praying, I live in that mode of constant awareness of God. And it just occurred to me, a year down the road, I might just regret what I said, but you don't edit this out, right? I think it'll be interesting to see what I think later on.
Sure.
So I think rest is like that in that sense. I think there may be practices within the context of the church, practices within Christian communities, practices that we engage with on an individual personal level, that forms that mode of life of resting in God, even though we may not always be conscious of the fact that we are resting in God.
Yeah, well, and it helps because it is kind of getting at that difference between experience of rest in terms of, as you said, going on vacation or, watching a baseball game from your couch on the weekend or something like that, to a much more kind of holistic view of rest, as what you're talking about is resting in God, which is not something that comes and goes necessally.
That's right.
Or potentially anyway. Like
no.
ideally it wouldn't.
No. I think you're absolutely right. The branch, Jesus says, is connected to the vine, right? And I think resting in God is like that. We are attached to God. And of course, there are seasons in which we feel like we're not attached to God, but by the Spirit, we are united with Christ. And therefore, even when we are not conscious of it, I trust that God is working within us.
So the promise here then is that one could be at rest even while working.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And yeah, so that's a helpful point to bring up, because restfulness isn't a psychological or physiological experience that we experience when we are ceasing from work, but it's in the midst of everything that we do, right?
Yeah.
Working, sleeping, playing, perhaps even suffering, that restfulness does indeed manifest. Even acknowledging the fact that the suffering is something that is permitted or granted by God, that acknowledgement itself can be a restful experience.
Yeah. So you've sort of honed in on this notion of providence in chapter 1, that there's a sense of resting in God's providential concern or providential care for us. And it struck me as an indication both of kind of where you're going, but then also of the role that Augustine plays in the book.
Yeah.
Right. So Augustine famously is the one who says that our hearts are restless until they rest in you at the beginning of Confessions. And then obviously Augustine is rooting all of that.
That's
in
right.
The providence of God and finding rest in that. So could you talk us through the role of Augustine in your own thinking here?
Yeah. I like that question, because it was a coincidence that Augustine became such a major figure. Some of the theologians, philosophers that I engage with happen to have been Augustinians when I just brought everything together. Augustine plays, I think, at least two roles. The first role is, as you've quoted him so well, right? Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. And so that gets at the idea of dependence on God, the definition of rest. And so in that fundamental way, Augustine plays, I think, one role in the book. The second role is there's a chapter on memory, because as I take it, when I think about rest, you have to think about rest in terms of some of the key domains of human existence, and time is one way, and memory manifests in that way. And Augustine in his Confessions thinks a lot about his memory and time. And in that particular moment, Augustine fits the way in which our memories, our restless memories, are healed. Is, to put it succinctly, it's through the act of praise. And so I can, for example, worry or be anxious about something that will happen in the future, or I can be full of regret of something that I've done in the past, or maybe filled with guilt and shame. These are all restlessness in our memories. But what praise does, and Augustine taught me this, is that praise is a way of reinterpreting our past, or the way in which we envision ourselves in the future. Well, how does that work? So, for example, when I'm singing the song, "It Is Well With My Soul," I'm not just saying those words or appreciating those words as if they are a piece of painting on the wall. But my story becomes integrated into those words. I'm singing, "It is well," despite the fact that X, Y, and Z. And so what praise does is that it brings together my own story or memories of my past and God's story together. And in that moment, as I see it, it heals some of the memories, restless memories that we have.
Yeah.
And so that's how Augustine kind of fits in.
Yeah. I mean, it's beautiful, because I know that, that a lot of the anxiety that can be produced in life is often arises from looking back on what we did do or what we didn't do and our failures in the past. And you spoke of it as being filled with regret for memories. And so I love the idea of connecting rest to memory, because actually there is a way to find those kind of nagging thoughts of all the things that hadn't happened or should have happened, or that I did poorly, that actually there can be rest from those.
Yeah. And I think it's really trusting. One of the ways in which God's story is working there is, as you say, it's God's providence, right? I recognize that God was part of the picture. God's sovereignty was part of it. And so we find a little bit of restfulness there, even though I should say I don't want this to be a simplistic solution, saying that, okay, now that you have the Bible, you can re-narrate your story and you're fine, right?
Yeah.
If you take trauma as an example, like the physical manifestation of it still remains, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that it begins a process of healing.
Yeah. So maybe it's not the silver bullet that fixes everything.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
But at least gets the process of healing started is what I might try to say.
Yeah. So then does one have to be committed to a kind of exhaustive account of divine sovereignty, for instance, for your book to kind of land?
Yeah, and can I maybe I should follow up? What do you mean by an exhaustive account of divine sovereignty?
Yeah, so we're talking about resting in God's providence in light of things that have happened that maybe shouldn't have happened, or we don't feel like it should have, or our own failures or things like that. And so we're resting in the providence of God. And so I would just imagine that a theologically attuned listener would be wondering, okay, so then do I have to assign agency for every possible event to God in order to find rest?
Yeah. I think so. When I think about providence, I think about providence broadly. You may have noticed that I don't really have a robust account of providence in the book. When I think about providence, I simply mean three things broadly, as I think at least some theologians might sign to. Like, one is that through God's providence, God sustains all things. God somehow is working as a primary agent behind things. The doctrine of concursus is what I have in mind here. And then God governs all things to bring things to their eschatological fulfillment. And I think one can affirm various understandings of human freedom in that picture.
Yeah.
I'm open to pushback here because maybe my understanding of providence hasn't been thought out very well. So
no, I mean, I'm mostly just curious of how the parts are kind of fitting together for you here in the book. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense because you don't come across in the book in any way as having a kind of a heavy-handed view of providence. Or something like that.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't approach the topic from a particular denominational, with denominational commitments.
Yeah.
I think there are broader commitments in the sense that I do work within a broader tradition.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that points to also the fact that you're not just like, you don't have one single denominational commitment that you're bringing to the table. You're also not only engaging with Augustine throughout this text. You have lots of other traveling companions that you take on board from kind of lots of different fun areas of the world. So Soren Kierkegaard makes an appearance, Blaise Pascal, so numerous others. So could you talk through some of your other traveling companions and how they show up here in the book?
Yeah, so we have, Augustine, we have Oliver O'Donovan, who's a theologian ethicist in the UK. His theological ethics has been helpful for me to think about the human side of things. So if God's economy works to delimit the different domains of our lives, how do we respond? And I think it's Oliver O'Donovan's works that help me think about how humans respond to that economy with the theological virtues of faith, love, and hope. And I think there's actually way more tacit in the book than I might have actually, that I'm saying right now. In the second chapter, I have Jean-Yves Lacoste, who's a French Catholic philosopher who helped me think about what place is and how we should think about place from a Christian perspective. There's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who helped me think about how Christ delimits our existence. I'm just like going through each chapter trying to figure out who's there. Colin Gunton, although a minor appearance, helped me think about the Spirit's role, the Holy Spirit's role, I think. yeah, Søren Kierkegaard, you've mentioned, where are we? Chapter 3, yeah, Pascal. Pascal is the one that helps me think about what rest and restfulness might mean vis-a-vis our ordinary lives and activities within our ordinary lives. How do we think about love and action in terms of restfulness? And then I think, Gregor of Nyssa in the last chapter, who I think balances the Augustinian account toward the end. I want to say that's it, but I might be missing other interlocutors. And then there's like their Bible, like all over the place.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you've brought together some wonderful conversation partners alongside of Scripture in the context of this question about rest. And you've done a fabulous job of it. So I do just want to say that this is an excellent book.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just brought you here to butter you up and make you feel nice, basically.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk then about the role of finitude. So you write a lot about the question of our own limits, and this is kind of the Oliver O'Donovan piece that kind of weaves its way through, and how I would imagine that at first blush, people might think that finitude would actually make things less restful. Right, because I am a finite person, now I can't watch TV and read that book that I want to read and coach my kids' flag football game all at the same time, right? I have to make these trade-off choices.
That's right.
And then I also have a limited amount of energy, and so at the end of the day, I'm tired. And so how does finitude actually contribute to rest and not just detract from it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And because each chapter goes into what that looks like in different domains, maybe I'll just pick one chapter and just describe how that might be the case. So in thinking, there's a chapter on how God delimits actions, our daily actions, activities. And I use the notion of portion that we get in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes says that we should eat, drink, and enjoy the work that God has given to us. That's our given lot or portion. And as I understand it, a portion is a delimited daily gift that God gives to us and grants to us.
Yeah.
This would include time for work, time for family. It includes seasons in our lives, includes the day and then the night. And if you think about this from, if I can use a practical example to illustrate this, if suppose that it's 8 p.m. And I go to bed fairly early, and if I devote 3 more hours to this class preparation for a class that I'm teaching tomorrow, my class will be A quality, right? But if I devote an hour, then it will be B, if not C quality, right?
Yeah.
I think the idea of finitude says that, you know what, it's okay to just spend an hour, and hopefully my students are not watching this part of the podcast. It's okay, right? It's okay because these tasks that we have daily is a God-granted portion. And when we receive that with gratitude and attend to it faithfully, we are attending to those things as an act of worship, right? And so my actions or my work isn't directed primarily toward my students in this case, but it's directed toward God, and then God uses it in whatever way God desires. Abraham Heschel, a Jewish philosopher, has, I think, a line that goes something like, rest on the Sabbath as if all of your works were completed. And I think that can be applied on a day-to-day basis, right? Rest at night and go to bed as if all of your works were completed. So that's one of the ways in which finitude works. And I think embracing our finitude and God-granted portions can give us some restfulness.
Yeah. I would imagine that, if there's a PhD student listening to this, they're probably thinking, well, it's nice for you to say, but you know, you don't have to learn Latin and Greek this week, you know, or whatever. I would also imagine that there were maybe moments in producing your PhD on the topic of rest that you were thinking, you know, this is not very restful right now. So how do you like practically go about adjudicating and making those kinds of decisions? You know, I guess my question is, how do you know when you have stewarded the gifts that God has given you?
That's a nice word.
Without obsessing over them.
I think that's $1 million question, right? And the first thing I'll say is I have to confess that the kinds of things that I really struggle to do is the kinds of things that I'm encouraging readers to do, right?
Sure.
So there may be a little bit of hypocrisy there, which I'm working on.
We're all preaching to ourselves to some extent, right?
That's right.
So
no, I think you're absolutely right. I wrote this book simply because it's what I needed to hear. To answer your question, there's really two things. I think there are things that we can learn about ourselves even apart from the Bible, right? We know, physiologically speaking, if we don't get 7 to 9 hours, depending on the kind of person you are, that's going to lead to long-term health damage, right? So there are, I think, guardrails that are provided by natural order, one might say. So paying attention to those boundaries is the first step. The second thing is, I think when God creates us new, we have freedom in Christ. So I don't think there's a strict formula for me to use to say, okay, this is a God granted portion, whereas this is not, right? So I think just trying things out, right? I think for a perfectionist listening to this podcast, being okay not submitting a perfected kind of work, right? Being okay with getting that first B or C, or maybe just doing B quality work throughout a season. So I think that's what I have.
I would imagine that people probably lean one way or the other, right? There's probably someone who leans a little more towards just not accomplishing much at all, you know, and that person might need to hear about the restfulness of stewarding the work that God has given them to do, and attending to it as an act of worship. And then on the other side, someone who's maybe prone toward worrying excessively about getting everything just right, and that person maybe needs to back off a little bit. I think that's exactly right. And I think Ecclesiastes, I wish I remember the verse right now, preaches precisely that, to not sway toward the side of laziness, nor trying to frantically hold together many things in these two hands, right? So I think, finding that middle way, and here I guess Aristotle's relevant here, the mean between things, which I think one can only figure out as they live their life. And even the kind of theological orientation that will help you make those kinds of discernments, you know. So I think it's really helpful that your book doesn't have a kind of how-to manual at the end of it, because in providing this theological rationale, you're allowing people to get a sense of the kind of framework or the principles around which we're trying to make these decisions. And then they can work out in their own lives how that needs to best apply. You know?
I don't know if I can put that in a better way. I think that's precisely it. I think the book tries to provide a theological framework for rest, and then the details you kind of put in yourself.
Absolutely. Okay, so you say a restful life flows from living in sync with the triune God's economy. And these references to the Trinity kind of are a significant part of the book. So what about the Trinity is particularly restful? And what about rest is Trinitarian? Maybe is another way of asking that question.
That's a nice question. A couple of things. The first thing is, just like, I think I mentioned this earlier, just like the branch is grafted onto the vine, humans are grafted onto the triune God. with that in mind, the Son and Spirit delimits our lives in certain ways. So to briefly share this, the Son is the one who holds all things together. He's the one from whom are all things, through whom are all things, and for whom are all things. And insofar as we are grafted onto Christ, we can see that there are limits that the triune God has set for the different domains of our lives. We receive our limitations and then life from Christ. And apart from Christ, we find ourselves restless. So that's like a broad framework there. The Spirit plays a role in a few ways. The Spirit, as a perfecter of all things, first of all, provides us with an end towards which we can move, right? All of human activity is directed toward some kind of aim or an end. And if that target is always moving, right, I will find myself restless. So, for example, if I desire to be an engineer at Google or at Silicon Valley, that becomes an end. But then when I get the job, my end might change again. And the end might be, well, I need to write the most creative code, right? And so the ends that always change make us restless. And so the Spirit provides an end that is achievable for us. The Spirit also works in a way that we cooperate with the Spirit, not in a competitive way, rendering our activities restful. In other words, there are particular things that the Son and the Spirit does in order to render our lives restful in the different domains of our lives. So place, activities, time, and then later God's self.
Yeah. Well, let's keep kind of going down that path, because you talk about being able to rest, being able to be in a state of rest, both while working and while relaxing. But that actually carries on, in a sense, eternally. And you bring in Gregory of Nyssa to talk about that dynamic between those two, that kind of movement and rest. And so talk about the role of Gregory of Nyssa here at the end, and specifically how the content of the beatific vision, the vision of God, that all life is aiming toward, how does that shape what rest means today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the first thing I'll say is, even though the last chapter is about the beatific vision, it also is a vision that we can proleptically experience in our current state. With that in mind, Gregory of Nyssa has this doctrine of epictasis, which basically says that human beings are always perpetually moving toward God. Human beings are finite, God is infinite, and therefore, once we experience God, we never experience God fully, and therefore we are perpetually drawn toward Him. This idea of perpetual progression is something that plays out in my understanding of the beatific vision. Human beings find restfulness in created goods, but also the Creator, God. And so we find restfulness in God. But my understanding of the beatific vision is that we first encounter and see God, and so we are happy and we are filled with joy. We find restfulness. But there's also another factor that contributes to the beatific vision, which is God's delight in our works. And so insofar as we have participated in God-granted portions in our lives as an act of worship, we see God's delight in us. And therefore, we are not only looking at God, but also God's delight in us, which makes that vision, the beatific vision, even greater. And in our own lives, what happens is that we move in and out of that vision, right? During worship, for example, we see God, we encounter God, and we see God pleased with our works, and we go back into our daily lives to participate in the portions that have been granted to us. And so it's a cycle of perpetually progressing toward God.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're kind of, ideally anyway, for right now, moving toward God and moving toward rest. But part of what you're saying is that once we're there, so to speak, you know, in the presence of God, that movement doesn't actually stop, right? It kind of continues.
I think so. I think I'm trying to bring in two recent depictions of the eschatological state. On the one hand, you have the traditional people arguing for the traditional view, the beatific vision. And then there are recent biblical scholars who get nervous about Platonic influence in Christian theology and argue for a new creation kind of eschatological state where we are continually working. I think what I try to do is kind of bring those two together.
Yeah, so they can be brought together.
I don't know. I'll let the reader be the judge.
Yes. Well, you will have to pick up David Shin's newest book, Rest, in order to make your own judgment call on that when you get to the final chapter. Well, David, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for talking us through your remarkable book. Again, this is Rest by Untek David Shin, and out with Baylor University Press now. Pick it up today at baylorpress.com. David, thanks for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. And you've actually read the book, and you might be some of the few people who've actually read it. So this was fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you for listening to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.